Greetings, class. I'm recording this on Saturday, on September 20th. I just completed assessing your IRRs and RTOs for week 4, and so I wanted to take this opportunity to highlight a few things and offer you some feedback. I recall that my last recording was somewhat lengthy. I'll try to be a little bit more brief in this one. First of all, some of you mentioned that the articles were dated in the sense that they weren't that they represent research that wasn't conducted recently. And while that may be the case, the shelf life of those particular articles are still very good. And in fact, in the case of the Bonta article in particular from 2008, that article represents really the first of its kind in terms of looking at parole officers or supervision officers' skills. And so there's been some research, not a ton, but some research that's occurred since then that has looked at the same thing in a broader scale, somewhat more rigorously. And the principles that are written about and presented in the Bonta article still hold true today, meaning that even when officers are presented with a very short amount of time, how they choose to spend that time, the things that they do, the things that they ask about, the things that they talk about, can have a lasting influence on behavior, particularly recidivism. In addition, I wanted to mention one of the articles mentions and presents to you meta-analysis. Some of you made some interesting mistakes, frankly, in your writing when you indicated that some of the officers in the study used meta-analysis on their offenders. That's just not correct. Meta-analysis is a research technique. It's a research technique that involves pooling several studies that are about the same subject, and it's a very powerful technique that's been in use in many different fields, including psychology, medicine, in recent years. And when I say recent, I mean in the last 30 or so years. Meta-analysis as a research technique has entered criminology and criminal justice, but it is not correct to say that the officers in the studies were using meta-analysis. Researchers use meta-analysis to study things that officers do, as well as other aspects of criminal justice and criminology. So, if you made that error in your IRR, you might want to consider cleaning that up for your IOW, as well as taking a closer read of the article themselves. In addition, and relatedly, I've mentioned this before, but it warrants repeating after reading your writing for this week. Many of you are still confusing probation supervision and parole supervision. As I've mentioned before, both activities represent supervision of offenders in the community, but probationary supervision is the community supervision of an offender in the community without having served time in prison or jail, for that matter, first. Parole supervision looks quite similar in terms of practice, but parole supervision is what occurs after someone has been incarcerated. And so I really am imploring you to clean that up in your writing and make sure that you're clearly delineating between the differences between those if it's necessary. So please keep that in mind. Many of you chose correctly to write about the principles, particularly from the Bonta article, the principles of risk, need, and responsivity. We will discuss those principles in a great amount of depth in the coming weeks, but this represents somewhat of an initial introduction to those concepts. Many of you in your writing were correct to point out the importance of the relationship that can be built between the officer and the client, but that really does open somewhat of a Pandora's box when it comes to what does that relationship look like. Are relationship skills something that can be taught to probation officers? The same would go for the skills in the articles like pro-social modeling, problem-solving skills, and empathy. I ask you, is empathy something that can be taught? Now, clearly it can be taught, but the question is, can empathy become a part of the skill set of a supervision officer? That's definitely something to keep in mind, and something that we may touch on later. getting back to some of your writing as well. Some of you, not many of you, and overall things were greatly improved from past week, and so thank you for that. It's very clear that many of you are stepping up your game and putting a lot more effort into your writing. Some of you still need some improvement. A few of you need some vast improvement in that regard. But one of the things that I saw that a couple people wrote about, keep in mind that this week is about the actual practices of the officers themselves. Some of you had a tendency to write about offenders and offender behavior, and ultimately offender behavior is something we're concerned about because we're talking about what strategies are best when our goal is to reduce recidivism, when our goal is to change behavior in the long term. But keep in mind, particularly when you're crafting and submitting your IOWs this week, that the focus of these questions is on the practice of the officers, and the desire is for you to compare the practices of the officers that you saw in a hard straight. By the way, some of you got the title of the film wrong. It's not a hard style; it's a hard straight. A hard straight. The skills of the officers as seen in a hard straight versus the skills of the officers as portrayed in the articles. To that end, I wanted to mention about the using the articles. Again, I want to emphasize that many of you did a much better job than you've done in previous weeks. So keep that in mind as going forward, and keep up the good work. On the other hand, do keep in mind that that it's not just enough to use a couple of quotes from the articles to indicate that you really use the material. And that's apparent sometimes in your writing as well. Like, for example, some of you chose to highlight a couple quotes from Bonta that indicate probation officers aren't doing enough of X, Y, and Z, and recidivism isn't being reduced. Well, it's true that that statement appears in some form in the article, but it's also true that that article is about a lot more than probation officers not doing enough of the right things. The article is about some probation officers who do a lot of the right things and the results that they get. Some of you chose to focus in on the limitations that Bonta presents, meaning the limitations of the research itself, the fact that they didn't have complete data on some of the officers, the fact that they utilized a relatively small group of officers, and that's okay. It's okay to mention that, but that shouldn't really be the focus. The objective is not necessarily to tear the article apart and indicate why it's not valid. Some of you use the term inaccurate, that the articles were inaccurate. Well, the articles aren't inaccurate. The articles portray the results of some empirical research. Now, all empirical research has limitations, but that doesn't necessarily make the results inaccurate, nor does it necessarily reduce the validity of the conclusions that are reached. A few of you mentioned about or focused in on the amount of time that officers have when interacting with their clients, and really that was the whole point of the article, was to examine the brief amount of time, whether we're talking about a Canadian model or a United States model, the brief amount of time that officers have, and whether or not that amount of time can be used to shape behavior. The evidence has indicated that yes, it is possible, but it depends on officer training, officer skill attainment, and the extent to which officers use those things with integrity. So I recommend focusing on that as well. Again, it's the practices of the officers that are at issue here as well. Each group, I think, this week had very good examples of IRRs. A couple of folks I want to highlight. Group 1. Group 1, I would say, take a look at Juan Saldana. Did a great job. Review his IRR if you have questions. Group 2, Julianne Kostoff was very good. I'm just going to highlight one person from each group. There were others. Group 2, there were several examples of very good IRRs. Group 3, Lauren Bell, Catherine Tegetoff, very good, or Tegetoff, I apologize if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly, were very good this week. Group 4, Group 4, Tamisha Davis did a very good job. Grant Halderman did a good job with the IRR. So, and again, I'm just highlighting one from each group. I'm not going to do this every week. It's not a competition, but I did want to share those since you have access to that information anyway. If you're looking for a good example in each group, I wanted to just real quickly mention a couple that were that stood out, but they certainly weren't the only ones that stood out. Keep up the good work, enjoy the weekend, and I will talk to you soon. Keep your questions coming.